share. There we go. We're good. So, guys, this is just for fun. I'm gonna probably post on my page and see if being libertarian wants to use clips or whatever. But I guess the idea here overall, you two are the best economists I know personally, and maybe have some ideas that I don't have or that I don't understand on the gold standard. So, and I guess why economies should be based on some sort of commodity. And
Is that a gold coin?
sorry.
Nee's holding a gold coin, I believe.
Oh yeah.
Just
There
thought
you
it's
go.
appropriate.
Definitely is. It definitely is.
But I have some somewhere, but I'm not bothered to get up and go get them and then come back.
Yeah, I just had some here. This is an Australian kangaroo. See, there's a kangaroo on there.
Yes,
I love this.
I like it. I like it.
That is very cool. I remember my dad used to have. He always had a few gold coins as his like emergency. If everything else fails, he can always trade in these gold coins. And I also thought it was very cool. I'd sneak into his room and pull out the secret little satchel it was in and look at them, and they were all cool and shiny. But yeah, no. What I actually want to talk about is libertarians talk a lot about the gold standard. For example, Ron Paul was big on auditing the Fed, talking against fiat currency, why we need to go back to the gold standard, and that type of thing. And for the average person who doesn't study economics, it like I've read a few books and I can understand kind of the reasoning why, but there's definitely some questions I would have as to how that would happen. But you know what? Let's. I'm going to leave it open. I'm not going to dominate the conversation here. Do you guys want to start by saying what you study or what you know, or should we just get right into it?
Yeah, I can speak to the gold standard.
Sure.
As at least what I know. As far as I understand, the gold standard relies on the so-called barter theory of money. Do you guys know what the barter theory of money is?
Of course, yes.
So basically, the idea that before there was money, people traded in barter and subsistence economy, and over time, as people traded in scenes and things like that, emerged in prospering competing media of exchange, and gold and silver emerged as desirable media of exchange, if that makes sense. And then later on, governments started sort of co-opting that process by and deposits and issue certificates of deposit that were basically like dollar bills that you turn in to get a dollar. And so for convenience sake, people would use those bills in exchange. And then at some point, the banks would be allowed to keep the gold and refuse redemption in specie, is what it's called, when people want to turn in their paper and obtain gold. And so we had a fiat money system. That's sort of, in a nutshell, from what I understand, sort of the case for the gold standard, going back to that system that restrains the government and going back to a system that allows or that uses a more commodity-based medium of exchange.
So if you don't mind me asking, so would that mean that everything all your money, whatever it is that's being exchanged, is based on, for example, in this case, gold? How much gold you have as a country kind of dictates how much money you're able to print and spend. That's the long and short of it.
That's sort of the idea behind it, yeah. And I should add that everything I just told you, I don't agree with. Okay, I gave you the case for the gold standard, but I found after a couple of years of research, I came across some evidence that has led me to believe that there's actually no empirical footing to support this story that I just told you about how gold started being used as money and then got co-opted by the government and then became paper money. sort of veered away from the natural use of money, from the natural use of a commodity as money. That's not something that seems to be very well footed in empiricism, if that makes sense. And I can go into, what follows from that, unless Balint wants to add some things or you have some questions.
Well, oh yes, what I'd like to add, hopefully I'm clear right now on the line. You guys can hear it well? Yeah, okay, good. What I'd like to add is that over time, throughout history of time, especially with money, when a commodity becomes a sense of money, the demand for that commodity, the industrial and consumer demand, must be exceeded over those two types of demands. And then only does that commodity become a medium of exchange altogether. Essentially, it transforms from a sense of commodity, which could be traded with each other, which it then becomes the medium of exchange, the actual commodity money itself. And essentially, what has happened through centuries that we've used obsidian as money, we've used gold and silver as money, we've used cow tongues as money. During World War II, the consumer industrial demands for cigarettes was way exceeded, and therefore we used cigarettes as a form of money altogether. And so the biggest problem with the libertarian movement today is that when people say we should go back to a gold standard, I would say it's not that we should go back to a gold standard. We should go back to a commodity-based standard, which is deemed by the marketplace, which dictates what is the actual commodity, which is above its consumer and industrial demand use per se, which in this case would be gold right now, but we don't know what it would be in the future, of course.
Silver, Bitcoin.
So it could be that.
Coffee beans.
Oh, actually, I would like to argue on the point of Bitcoin is that Bitcoin does not have a huge amount of industrial or consumer demand usage, as in its functionality is not per se for consumption or industrial use. But the reason why Bitcoin, well, in my opinion, at least in my economics opinion, why Bitcoin is so popular right now is because it serves as a very good function as a medium of exchange per se. It eases the transactions between one party to another. So therefore, Bitcoin itself, rather than it being a commodity money or a certified commodity money, I would say is somewhat like a fiat money, but it's a proto-fiat money where there's actual substance and use towards it, rather than it just being printed out without any faith or any actual, without actual representation, just randomly created out thin air. Because of course, Bitcoin has a limit in its amount of units, but at the same time, those units do not have that much usage per se in the real world, other than for the fact that it helps with exchanging between two parties in terms of US dollars or Canadian dollars. And in fact, Shoshank, I believe, the quote that he said about Bitcoin, how it helps serve as an exchange for the US dollar, I tend to agree with him on that point, because that is its only functional demand per se. It's a very, very good type of exchange unit, rather than it being a commodity unit by itself. So therefore, I would say Bitcoin is a proto-fiat money rather than a commodity-based money per se. Well, no, of course, there's nothing wrong with that. It's just the way that I would classify it is different towards what, for example, another economist would classify it as a commodity-based money.
I see. If you guys don't mind, I'm probably going to be asking a lot of really dumb questions here. Just because I
don't think so.
I really want to get my head
fine.
around this. I'm hoping that old adage, the "there's no such thing as a stupid question," actually holds true here. But so just to be clear, you're both economics students right now, or students of economics, or in some way studying it, right?
As far as I'm concerned, I'm actually not an economist, just to be clear. I studied industrial engineering in Germany, technology management. I have a master's degree in technology management in the US. Okay. I took a lot of economics classes at school, probably more than most people, and I could have probably easily studied economics if I wanted to, but I didn't. And subsequent to my studies, I started reading a lot. I started writing and that kind of stuff, you know. So from that standpoint, I may have some valid opinions on economic matters.
Awesome.
Oh, well, for me, my actual major is accounting and finance, but I'm obtaining a minor in economics as we speak. And as well as that, I would like to further pursue a bachelor degree in history once I finish this bachelor degree as
Nice.
well.
That'd be cool. Definitely cool.
So, oh yeah, sorry, Nate, I don't know if we would disagree on how we would classify Bitcoin as either proto-fiat money or a certified commodity money, but that's another argument for another day, which can go on forever.
I don't think I disagree with you. Actually, I wrote a post on Being Libertarian. I think it's titled "How the Fiat Money Explains, how the Fiat System Explains Bitcoin's Value," and in it I outline how Bitcoin actually mimics a lot of the characteristics of the fiat money system.
And exactly.
Yeah, and one of the things that I point out in there is that because you said there's no industrial use for Bitcoin, I would disagree with that, because there's actually you can store a hash that verifies the proof of the existence of a document at a certain moment in time in the Bitcoin blockchain. For example, Julian Assange recently proved that he's alive by using the Bitcoin blockchain. So there are some uses that are uses other than medium of exchange that you could argue people need Bitcoins for in order to perform those uses. So even for that alone, there's going to be a demand for Bitcoin to perform those activities. So I would argue that that's a pull, that's a demand that's in the market for Bitcoin that's outside of the uses as a medium of exchange.
Well, however, my point of argument saying is that it's not necessarily that there's no industrial use demand, it's that the industrial demand use is not as great of an effect on why Bitcoin is valuable compared to how it serves as a medium of exchange per se. Rather,
yeah.
So of course, you are correct in what you say on how that industrial demand for Bitcoin does exist, but those industrial demands are not the main reason why Bitcoin would be classified in this sense. If you get what I'm saying, it's more that it's a medium of exchange rather than an industrial demand commodity per se. And this is why I say it's a proto-fiat money rather than a certified commodity-based money per se.
I would say that's, I would probably agree, but I'd say that's an open question. I think we don't know where's Bitcoin going down the road. You know, maybe it's
of course.
Industrial uses will be much more relevant than its use as a medium of exchange. We'll see, I guess.
Of course.
Can I just backtrack a second here and just ask a question about Bitcoin? What is it exactly that keeps Bitcoin from being able to do what the Federal Reserve does, for example, just print or just create money out of thin air or create Bitcoin out of thin air?
Well, I don't know much about Bitcoin. That's a niche field. Because he knows that in depth.
Yeah. So the algorithm specifies that every time as a miner you solve a block, you currently get rewarded with 12.5 Bitcoins. And before that it was 25, and before that it was, I think, 50 actually initially. So over time, the block reward, which is the only way by which Bitcoin can be introduced into the Bitcoin economy, will drop to 0. And I think the last Bitcoin will be mined in 2140 or something like that. So the number, by virtue of its algorithm, can never be more than 21 million Bitcoins in circulation.
Okay, so technically, it's not. I mean, it's a money, it's a currency, but it's not a currency in the way that we would use our currency.
Yeah, no. I mean, it's something. I don't think we necessarily know really what it is quite yet. It's a digital token that allows you to have access to the blockchain. And ultimately, what does that mean? Is it a currency? Is it a store of value? Is it a access token to a decentralized immutable permanent ledger? It's all those things. You know, we ultimately, people always have a hard time classifying Bitcoin because they try to put it in terms that we know, but it's something completely new. So there's some aspects to it that we don't know yet.
Of course, what I'd like to add is that Bitcoin by itself is a money by itself per se, as in by its fundamentals, it's a money by itself. And technically speaking, you can form currencies around the money itself. So let's just say if I wanted to, I can issue the Balland dinar Bitcoin currency, or the Balland Bitcoin currency. So this therefore means my currency is backed up by the proto fiat money, which is Bitcoin per se. And then therefore for every single Balland Bitcoin that you use, I'll have to, sorry, when you come to redeem it from me or whatever services which use my currency, we'll have to give you the Bitcoin back in exchange.
Okay, I gotcha. So
Bitcoin is the money itself.
It is money itself, but it's also the basis of the money. So it's like the gold, if you were using actual gold to spend.
Well, that's how I see it. But I'm not sure if that's completely correct. Because I'm not very knowledgeable on Bitcoin, like in its depths and how it works. Of course, Nii is here, which can help us with that for sure.
Is that how you would classify it there, Nii?
By the way, my full name is Nima, just FYI.
Oh, Nima, yeah.
No worries.
Sorry.
No worries. Would I classify Bitcoin as a money? Is that what you're asking?
Well, the way that it was described here a few seconds ago by Balland was, or even the way you described it a little bit, was it almost sounded like if we were to get the closest possible comparison, it would be if we had gold and we had stacks of gold that people could find, and then you would take that gold and make coins and use those actual coins as currency. So you're actually using bits of your limited stockpile.
I would say Bitcoin, you could say a very simplistic definition of Bitcoin that is probably arguably close is it's like digital gold.
Okay.
Yes, I would agree on that point. But just to clarify the confusion is that currency is technically the name that we give towards the medium, sorry, not the medium of exchange, towards the specimen which we use for the medium of exchange per se. So for example, when we say US dollar, we're technically saying that this is the name of the specimen. The currency is the US dollar, which represents the specimen. The specimen is the note, which represents, for example, a Bitcoin, gold, cigarettes, whatever the hell it is, which has been issued by banks. Yeah, whatever it's based on, per se. That's technically the meaning of a currency, or the name of a currency, per se.
Okay, that makes sense. Sorry, you were going to say something?
No. I'm done with my point.
Okay. Yeah, no, so that kind of, that makes a lot more sense to me in that regard. And then that kind of ties a little bit back into what you were saying about earlier about libertarians saying go back to the gold standard, and how that's not really the best option going forward.
I mean, if we want, we can talk about my criticism of the empirical basis for the gold standard crowd. And if you don't mind, I would like to read from an article from The Atlantic that summarizes it pretty well.
Sure, yeah, that'd be great.
So going back to the concept of the barter theory of money that I explained earlier, different commodities competing to become the most desirable medium of exchange out of a barter economy. So now economists have actually done, as far as I know, very little anthropological research to verify the barter theory of money empirically. And there's an article in The Atlantic that I can just link you to the summary here in the chat real quick. Actually, where's the chat here? I always miss. Okay, here it is. Okay, all right. I'm going to quote.
Excuse me.
Have parts of the globe. No example of a barter economy, pure and simple, has ever been described, let alone the emergence from it of money. wrote the Cambridge anthropology professor Caroline Humphrey in a 1985 paper, and that's a peer-reviewed research paper. All available ethnography suggests that there never has been such a thing. When barter has appeared, it wasn't as part of a purely barter economy, and money didn't emerge from it. Rather, it emerged from money. After Rome fell, for instance, Europeans used barter as a substitute for the Roman currency people had gotten used to. In most of the cases we know about, barter takes place between people who are familiar with the use of money, but for one reason or another don't have a lot of it around, explains David Graeber, an anthropology professor at the London School of Economics. No academics I talked to were aware of any evidence that barter was actually the precursor to money, despite the story's prevalence in economics textbooks and the public's consciousness. Some argue that no one ever believed barter was real to begin with. The idea was a crude model used to simplify the context of modern economic systems, not a real theory about past ones. I don't think anybody believes that was ever a historical situation. Even the economists writing the textbook. Michael Beggs, a lecturer in political economy at the University of Sydney, told me, it's more of a thought experiment. So it's a thought experiment.
Well, of course, I would agree. I would agree on that point, that technically speaking, we haven't had any rise of an actual barter economy per se. I don't think a barter economy has ever happened, except if we go maybe millions and millions, okay, not millions, when humanity first came into existence. You get the point.
On small levels.
On very, very small levels, of course. But the thing is that how did money come to existence? Of course, some people will say, oh, the government made money. Of course, that is false. That wouldn't be the case. That wouldn't be the case in most cases per se. However, it's very hard to pinpoint how money actually comes into existence, how a medium of exchange comes into existence per se. But however, we do know the theory on why the medium of exchange does come into existence. Of course, there are some examples where the medium of exchange was issued by the government, like Nima's article points out with, I believe, the King of England with the sticks.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Exactly.
that's an example where money did come out as a medium of exchange, but those medium of exchange did not tend to last very long, over the long run, of course.
700 years, the tally sticks.
But it wasn't very practical at the same time. As in most cases, they wouldn't last very long if they were issued by the government, because it has to come from a social construct. Money is a social construct rather than a governmental construct per se.
Okay.
So of course we don't have an example of a barter economy, but we at least do know the theory of why money comes into existence per se. And in most cases, it doesn't come into existence from governments altogether.
Gotcha. Because yeah,
Well, yeah. Sorry to interrupt.
No, go ahead.
I would say that I would disagree with you on that, because in my research, I've actually found a lot of evidence for state-sponsored or state-created money. It's not just the split tally sticks, but and those go back quite a bit. I mean, that 700 years. That's longer than the United States has existed. So that's not a bad track record, in my opinion. But it may be true that systems and governments fell, and then with that, the money system fell. Of course, that's very well possible. But as far as we know, empirically, government has always been issued, even the Roman days, the government declared a tax on its population and declared the tax in a certain token. For example, let's say I'm Nima and I have a tribe of 100 people, and we are in a subsistence economy, and I want to turn it into a monetary economy. Then what I do is I declare a tax of 1 Nima buck per week for every tribal member. Okay, everyone now owes me 1 Nima buck. And now everyone suddenly needs NEMA bucks because they owe them to me. So what I have to do, I have to spend them into existence. So I hire people to become my rain dancers or my medicine men, or build bridges and roads, maybe even.
So many roads.
So then, I introduce a token that I demand in tax payments first, and now people have it, so they can make the tax payments that I've imposed earlier on. So the tax just becomes a tool to give the money value, to create a demand for the money, and spending is just a way to then give people the tokens that they need to make those tax payments.
However, my proposed argument towards that is, yes, Arthur, you're in for a bit of a show, because this is just
right ahead.
yeah, this is just a disagreement on the rising of money per se, between MMT theorists and Austrian theorists. It's just a small disagreement. It's nothing big. It's not like how the Keynesians describe money. No, it's nothing like that. Of course,
it's not the retarded.
We at least, yes, we at least have some logical consistency behind our theories per se. But I'll tend to disagree, because essentially, before the tokens were issued, there must have been some medium of exchange which must have been used. And I'm not sure about historically in Roman times, or when we started using tally sticks, but if there was no actual medium of exchange, then economic growth must have been so insufficient that, for example, the Roman Empire wouldn't have been as big as it is per se. So essentially, before the Roman Empire actually issued coins and then used, of course, what the MMT theorists would say via taxation and via circulation of money, in order to circulate money within the economy, there must have been some sort of medium of exchange which would allow for everyday transactions to happen, or else it would have been a pure barter economy. So if we know that there was no pure barter economy, then of course there has to be a medium of exchange before the tokens were issued in the first place. So therefore, my argument is that before the tokens were exchanged, such as the NEMA buck, there must have been something the NEMA buck has to be based on, such as gold, silver, obsidian, or cow tongues, which we've used in the past as a medium of exchange. So therefore, that NEMA buck has to be paid with some sort of medium of exchange, such as when the Roman Empire, for example, issued, I don't know, their coins, there must have been gold or something flowing towards the Roman Empire government before the actual tokens can be exchanged per se.
Well, I would say what has to be there has to be some sort of power on the part of the sovereign to impose this taxation system, but I don't necessarily agree that there would have to have been a medium of exchange, because in my example, for example, I started with a subsistence economy without any medium of exchange. We're just living hand to mouth, which is not unempirical necessarily. Another thing I would add is that actually some anthropologists suggest that we have earlier evidence of monetary transactions than we have evidence of language. So we don't even really know how far back money goes, as far as I'm aware. And a lot of anthropologists and economists have made that case. So ultimately, we don't know. But
we know nothing. We know nothing, basically.
Well, ultimately, we don't. Obviously, we can't go back in a time machine and figure it out. But we can only hypothesize. But we will never know definitively how it began. Obviously,
so it's a little bit of a chicken or the egg type.
In a way, yes.
Question, right? Like what came first was, what did the government impose a tax, which then forced a currency or forced a monetary system into place, or was there a monetary system that the government just kind of co-opted into their own
and the evidence we have seems to support the state theory of money, as far as I'm aware.
Of course, I wouldn't disagree with the state tax theory of money, but I would say that something has to be added before the state tax theory of money. There must have been at least some sort of monetary supply, which was not realized by the government or not recorded in history per se. As in, not necessarily not recorded in history, as in it has to be imposed so that a barter economy does not emerge per se. because of course we have no evidence of a barter economy. So therefore, there must have been at least another economy with a medium of exchange before an official monetary base has been formed by the government via the issuing of tokens, etc., etc., etc. within that storyline. I don't disagree with that storyline. I just disagree that, what it was before it. And of course, this is like the chicken and the egg question. Which one came first, the medium of exchange or the token system? And I would say the medium of exchange came first, because logically speaking, if we did not have a barter economy, we must have had something as a medium of exchange. There must have been something somewhere. That's the only logical consistency behind it. Of course, I'll have to do some research in order to find the the actual qualitative evidence behind it. And I am confident there should be qualitative evidence behind it.
But I mean, if we were to kind of make up a scenario here for a second, just for fun, if you go back several thousand years here, you have a very tribal system of living for humans, right? So Bedouins in the Arabian, or in your part of the world there, Balint, are probably a good example, right? Or Native Americans in North America or whatnot. So
a collectivist command economy.
Right. And in some way, you would assume in a small tribe where it's mostly kind of one family or one large extended family, you might not have needed a method or a currency per se. But once that started to transition into cities where you had a ruler and you had a government and you had a central power, that's probably where you'd have to, on some level, start pumping out a currency that everyone uses, and then between those cities, making countries and so on and so forth.
Of course, I don't disagree on that point. Of course, that point stands valid. Historically, we do have points where, such as the tally stick, the phenomenons of the tally stick per se has come into existence.
Which, by the way, sorry,
yes.
Not to throw off your thought, just for anybody who will ever listen to this, we're going to link the article on the tally sticks so that you guys can actually read more into it. Anyways, go ahead. Sorry.
So, of course, when we're transitioning from a small tribal community towards a big city, before that transition has actually happened towards where we need a currency, a token system where a token system comes into play. Of course, the cities which grew bigger did not actually use collective methods of putting resources together. For example, let's just say all the farmers bring their carrots, and all the sheep herders bring some meat and wool. Of course, there has to be some sort of medium of exchange between them, right, before we actually transition into a bigger city. So as time from that little tribal city, before becoming into at least a city with governance and other forms of government coming into play, there must have been some kind of medium of exchange which has evolved in that path per se, because we can't have a pure barter economy. So therefore, there must have been at least some empirical evidence, such as using salt, cow tongues, and other things, which there is actual evidence. We have qualitative evidence that we've used these items as medium of exchange before the token system came into effect per se. And
I'd like to see that, just FYI. I'm curious about that evidence.
I'm sure I can find it, because
not right now, but just later.
Oh, later, of course.
Yeah.
Of course. But because of course, if you do the logical math behind it, as I would like to say, the logical math, of course, although mathematics is logical, technically when we speak of logic, we have to think about it in a qualitative sense in order to flow from one spot to another. Before the tokens were issued, there must have been something which allowed for a medium of exchange if there was no barter system per se, before an actual government has formed and then those token systems came into play. And that's my argument behind it. And what I would say is, as we used cow tongues and many other different types of forms of money, those types of forms of money were the medium of exchange before a token system came into play. And therefore the token system, as when you actually collect the tokens from the government, either via, like Nima said, infrastructure spending, etc., there must have been at least some kind of exchange, which is either a labor exchange or an actual commodity exchange per se.
And one interesting, at least one part of this that interests me, is that when you read some of these old stories, even stories that you'd hear in, for example, the Bible, where you have, someone like Abraham, who apparently was very wealthy, but according to the writings there, his wealth was mostly in sheep, or in some sort of flocks, or some sort of,
Land.
or land, or something useful, I guess, to people of those days. It doesn't talk much about gold and silver. Of course, it's not. there's lots of other evidence out there. There's lots of other historical context, but it's interesting because that was something that always struck me when I was younger. I was like, okay, so in those days, animals and servants and whatnot, that was wealth. That was kind of the basis of your wealth. So I don't know if that kind of ties into more of a barter type system, where you would trade sheep or trade slaves or trade whatever it is that was a part of an individual's wealth in those days. Then again, this is all just there's not a lot of context to kind of start really drilling down and finding truths here. It's more just ideas and thoughts.
So since you brought up the Bible, are you familiar with Matthew 22:21?
Not off the top of my head, but probably, yeah.
I'm not familiar with any of this.
Yeah, it's basically, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's.
Yeah.
And the anecdote says somebody asked Jesus, so what should we give this coin to Caesar or not? In other words, should we pay our taxes or not? And then Jesus asked, well, whose head is on it? And then they say Caesar's. And then he says, well, okay, then render to Caesar what's Caesar's. So one more piece of evidence.
Even in those days, people hated taxes.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, that's an extremely interesting conversation, because
we're done?
No,
conversation.
We're not done at all.
Oh, thank God, because that was such a short conversation. I'm enjoying this. I'm enjoying this.
Yeah, same here.
I'm just trying to recap it all in my head right now, actually. But you guys can continue. I just wanted to throw in that little bit about flocks and kind of that barter.
Well, if we
potential barter system.
I mean, I could just chip away a little bit more at the commodity money theory by reading from a passage that talks about the Roman coins.
Yeah.
Okay, this is from a great book, by the way. I recommend it to everyone. It's called Modern Money Theory by Randall Wray.
Yes.
You've read it?
No, I haven't read it, but I've heard about it.
So what he writes here is, most critics of modern money theory and of so-called fiat money in general imagine a past in which money was closely tied to a commodity like gold, which constrained the ability of both government and banks to create money out of thin air. The best example was the precious metal coin that supposedly gave real value to government money and forced government to actually get gold in order to spend. A strict gold standard with 100% gold backing against paper notes issued by government or banks accomplished the same task. The reality was always quite different, however. As argued before, obviously I cannot present a history of money here. Please see the discussion above on commodity money. Put it this way, gold and silver coins were the sovereign's IOUs that happened to be recorded on metal rather than on paper or electronic balance sheets. In truth, coins usually circulated far above metallic value, at a nominal value proclaimed by the sovereign. This is termed nominalism. The sovereign set the nominal value through proclamation, just like today's pennies that are worth a cent. And their value was not necessarily stable. Governments devalued them, which means announcing they'd be accepted at half the former value in payments to the government. By the way, back then, a lot of those coins didn't have numbers on them, right? So
they'll just use them as weights.
Sovereign would just say, okay, now you have to pay me twice. What was it?
They used to use weights in some cases, but of course that's very subjective of what the coin is actually made of within the weight itself. Of course, some incidences in history, well, yeah, they speak for themselves when people realize, oh, that's.
They also.
Oh, sorry, go on, Nima.
They also debased them by reducing metallic content, which did not necessarily change their nominal value at all. To be sure, there are cases of relatively stable coinage and prices for long periods of time, but these are strong and stable governments that adopted strong nominalism rather than metallism, the principle that a coin would be accepted at a value determined by its metallic content. Indeed, the most unstable periods for coins coincided with weak kings who resorted to weighing.
Sorry, Nima, you cut out a bit.
While rejecting light coins. As discussed, this created Gresham's law dynamics, forcing everyone to weigh coins, accepting heavy coins in payments, but trying to make payments in light coins. A real monetary mess. This was finally resolved by going all the way to nominalism, coining only base metal, and destroying the coin clippers business model. That's just something I thought was interesting.
So, it was, yes.
So what that...
Oh, yes. I'm just going to read this off from a website. So basically, I'll just link this in a second. As commerce developed through medieval Europe, another use for tally records was found. With coins in shortage and the population largely illiterate, as Nima had explained in some cases within that quote, I believe, a booking method was needed to record mutual exchanges and outstanding debts. And therefore, King Henry I, son of William the Conqueror, is credited with the inventing of the tally stick system when he ascended the throne of England in 1100 AD. So, as that small passage says, there was a shortage of coinage within medieval Europe at that time. So this therefore shows that before what's his name? Sorry, I'm not very good with anything before. I'm not very good with anything before the Industrial Revolution or Europe for that matter. So just give me a second. King Henry I.
No worries.
So when King Henry I issued the tally system to record debts, there was already a form of recording, of not recording debts, but of an actual dollars. And those coins weren't governmental issued coins, as far as I believe, from what the passage has told me. So before the actual token system comes into play, there must have been, again, a medium of exchange which was being circulated. And that medium of exchange was coinage at that time. But however, as the passage said, people weren't very illiterate, and coinage wasn't anymore, as Nima would like to say, valuable as they used to weigh light coins. And of course, there's a lot more to that passage. Basically, a token system arose because there was a demand for that token system per se. But before that token system actually came into play, oh, sorry, there wasn't a demand, my bad. There was, someone thought of the token system per se, then the demand came for that token system. As of course there was enforcement by governmental law, etc., etc. So as I'd like to say, there must have been a medium exchange before the token system comes into play, and that's of course what the passage I found said about the medium of exchange. There was coinage before the token system came into play. Now, whether that coinage system, the uses of coins as the medium of exchange, was issued by government or issued by blacksmiths or whoever it was, that's of course a different story and a very hard way to actually trace back historically, per se. Well, is there anything Nima would like to add to it?
So I think the coin, I mean, at least in the example that I brought up, the coins were always minted by the sovereign. So maybe those were private coins. It's very well possible. And also, but just to add to your point, even back in Roman and Greek days, apparently, and I don't have any immediate evidence to back this up, but what I heard is that they also had bar tabs back then and other measures like that to record debt. So, for example, they literally would have some kind of board, I guess, in the bar where they would put lines, where they put scratch lines on it to record debts owed by customers instead of using any actual money, and that would sort of function on top of the coins that were issued back in those days.
To what you were saying before, Nima,
Mhm.
about excuse me, about the value of the currency not necessarily even being based in the commodity itself,
Mhm.
but more on
Yeah.
what value was prescribed to it by the sovereign in those days. Is that in essence suggesting that what we do today with our fiat currencies and electronic banking and whatnot is really just an enhanced version of what has always been going on?
That's what I would say. So what I would say is that as far as we're aware, at least that's the case I'm making, the fiat money system that we know, that a lot of libertarians and Austrians sometimes think that it's not real, it's fake money. But as far as I'm aware, it seems as though it's actually a lot of history to that kind of monetary system. So the dollar bill you hold in your hands, people say, well, it's just a piece of paper. Okay, but it is, you can pay $1's worth of taxes with it. That's why it has $1 value. And that's sort of corroborated by the accounts of Roman history with coins that would circulate far above their metallic value in exchange transactions.
Sorry, Nima. I have a question slash what's it called? Well, in our slightly mini debate, a aha got you moment type of question. So within the free banking era of the United States, banks would usually used to issue their own tokens per se. So if they would issue their own tokens per se, isn't that fundamentally saying that it's not only governmental agencies which would issue the tokens, but also private institutions can also issue tokens per se? Now, of course, the US dollar did exist before then, but the free banking era would have had consistently many different types of US dollars, and no matter what type of name you can put in front of it, either US dollar or US communist or whatever the hell that name is prescribed to it. Essentially, that it doesn't have to only be the function of the government to issue the tokens, but private institutions can also issue the tokens. And in this case, within this history of time, many of the banks accepted gold and silver deposits as their form for issuing such tokens within the economy. Now, of course, before then, we did have a token system where the government did issue money per se. They issued the US dollar via the First Bank of America and First Bank of America and the Second Bank of America itself. But however, within that transitional period, those two banks did not exist. And therefore, those actual type of money in circulation was not widely used compared to the private institutions, private institutions specimens which were being used. So my argument in this sense is that if private institutions within this time period, and then of course there's other form factors such as the free banking era of Scotland, the free banking era of Sweden, I believe. Was it Sweden? It's one of the Scandinavian countries. But what I'm saying is that basically if the government was the issuer of tokens, then why in these historical settings did these tokens technically disappear and private tokens arise from what was deemed as the medium of exchange, such as gold and silver, altogether? Now, this is my aha question to you.
No, I mean, I don't necessarily disagree that there were experiments with different private money systems here and there. I think the main point there is that on a long scale, long-term history level, they haven't necessarily lasted very long. Another thing is that even today we have, it doesn't mean that when I say the government declares a tax, introduces a token, that doesn't mean that they remain forever the only entity that issues this token, because in today's system, we have the government deficit spending and thus introducing money, but we also have private banks lending money into existence via a checking account markup. And the checking account markup is, however, a claim to a government token. So when a bank lends money, they have bank reserves in their bank account. And when they make a loan, they, for example, Arthur, if I'm a bank, I give you a loan, I will create a checking account deposit for you, and it will mark it up by $5,000. That means I owe you $5,000 of government-issued tokens in last resort. However, any bank will accept this checking account markup period in the settlement of private debts. So the checking account markup by itself becomes valuable because a lot of people need it to settle private debts with so-called private banks. I would just call them, the government's lending agents, but we call them private banks today. So you can say that there is emergence of the kind of private money that trades at par with bank reserves and cash issued by the government, because number one, we have government deposit insurance, and number two, all of these markups are accepted by all banks that are part of the system in the settlement of liabilities. And since there's always people who are in debt to private banks, there's always a very universal demand for even just the checking account markups, which are not government issued tokens in and of themselves.
Well, I'd like to get back to the point when you said that these free banking eras do not necessarily last as long as they should. However, from what I understand from the free banking era in the United States, that there's a lot of misconception behind the free banking era in the United States, as we'd like to call as wildcat banking. But I read a research paper which basically concludes that the wildcat banking era became more sustainable over the long term. And especially that, especially with states that did not ban the use of wildcat banking, as in some states actually physically banned the use of these currency notes being issued by certain banks over the long term, such as in states such as New York and, well, I can't quite remember which are the other states, which had a very high, long sustainability within this time period. Frederick Hayek really does support the free banking era, which I agree with them, because again, this is my saying aha to you. There was a medium of exchange before the token system. It's our aha moment. One of the few reasons why we believe there is one. But essentially speaking, the free banking era had ended because Lincoln and Congress basically passed the bill through the Civil War, the Banking Act, I believe, of 1963 and 1960 something like that.
18, right?
18.
Oh, sorry, 18. My bad. 18. Gosh, 19. 100 years a bit over time, but essentially speaking, the only reason why those charters were passed was only due to the fact that taxation was needed to finance the wars, which had with the Civil War per se for the federal government, rather than the actual free banking era was being unsustainable. Because if we look at Scotland in its sense, that also happened to Scotland as well, when the UK in general being formed actually did pass a law which unified technically the taxation and the issuance of currency per se, like what happened in the United States as well. So it's just a clarification that there's a misconception behind the free banking era, and that I would say that, like you said, of course, the issuer of the tokens does not necessarily always stay the same. But however, I would say that it's not always the government being the issuer of the token and then taxing those tokens in order to control the money supply. Now, I don't disagree with that theory at all. Of course, there's some validity towards the theory, and it does logically make sense altogether. But what I say is that, of course, it's my main point of the argument that there must have been a medium of exchange before, or even after that token system, another medium of exchange must have risen, which this free banking era further validates that point of view, because of course we had the first and second Bank of America, then we had the free banking era, and the free banking era essentially stopped using what we can say is the issued tokens by the second Bank of America and the first Bank of America altogether. Of course, this could have continued until Lincoln came out of nowhere. Is like, no, you're no longer using free banking era currencies. You're now going to use a unified national currency, the US dollar, which is issued by the Treasury.
So free banking. Sorry, go ahead. I'll ask after.
I mean, no, sorry. I'm done. Oh, well, that's just an insight, in my opinion.
I was just going to ask, so free banking, just to clarify, that was that individual banks would actually print their own money or would actually distribute their own version of currency? Is that what that means?
And in basic, yes, that's what it was in basic. And in many cases, it was very successful on the time periods which they've occurred. But in other cases, governmental interferences had actually stopped such issuance of currencies, or limited or restricted, placed some restrictions on those periods of time, such as the National Banking Act, which was passed throughout the mid 18th century. It's 19th century. Oh my God, my timelines. What is this? What is wrong with me today?
It's all good. Yeah, that's
century.
Sorry?
I was just saying, you just like the 20th century.
I don't know. Who knows why? Maybe it's a fulfilled prophecy where I discovered something in the 20th century historically.
What was this banking period? What was this free banking period? From when to when?
1837, after the Panic of 1837, when the second Bank of America basically collapsed because Jefferson did not sign it over, towards 1861, I believe, 1860. And now, of course, if we look at the empirical data throughout most of its historical timeline, we see a phenomenal growth in we see a really good growth in economic growth, a very good economic growth up towards the Civil War itself. And then when the Civil War was about to start, of course, this is due to not to an economic phenomenon, but rather a social phenomenon, which then caused an economic slowdown per se. So it wasn't really the free banking era's fault on why, technically speaking, if you used its final end of the data, where it starts to look a bit poor and overall it's not a good system. This wasn't due to the free banking era, but rather due to social problems per se. Overall, the empirical evidence, both in Scotland and in the US, the free banking era was a very prosperous time. In fact, there's a quote by Alan Greenspan, which, of course, we all know who's Alan Greenspan, I believe. Essentially, he says that the free banking era is a very, the wildcat banking era is a very mislabeled type of era. It's very misconcepted from what actually happened within that era.
Yeah, he actually wrote he said some good positive things about the gold standard as well, if I remember correctly.
Yes.
Before he became Fed chairman.
Yes, there's a funny story with Ron Paul. Ron Paul was with he had the article that Greenspan, the signing. Yeah, that was it.
Sorry, what was it? He had an article of Greenspan praising the gold standard?
Praising the gold standard before a Congress hearing was happening with the Federal Reserve. In the cabinet meeting room, Ron Paul asked Alan Greenspan, "Do you still believe in the stuff that you wrote?" And after he said, "Yes, of course." And after he's like, "Can you please sign this for me?" And Alan Greenspan actually signed it for Ron Paul.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it is. It is.
That brings me to a question. If there's no response to what we've talked about so far.
Well, I would like to see if you could send me a link to that paper about the free banking era. That would be
of course great. I'll try to find it somewhere, because I've done this research like a year ago, so it's somewhere on the internet, wherever it is. God help me trying to find it.
So what you were saying there, Balin, was that there was that free banking era, and that was a positive as far as the economy was concerned?
Yes, in many cases it was a positive. Of course, there were incidents where there were negative outcomes throughout the free banking era, but overall, the aggregate shows that it was a positive rather than a negative altogether. And throughout that period of U.S. history, the U.S. economy actually did flourish very well within that short period before the lead up to the Civil War. And let's just say if we can replicate a perfect growth model, um, within the free banking era. Of course, it would never be perfect in any circumstances.
For sure.
If we look at a perfect growth model on their fiat currency throughout the U.S. history now, and a perfect growth model with the gold standard, and then a perfect growth model with the free banking era, the perfect model of the free banking era by far outpaces the perfect models of a gold standard and a fiat and a solely state controlled fiat system per se, because there's actual competition between the issuance of what we would say are either certified commodity monies or actual fiat monies per se. Because you can have a whole entire fiat system which is being issued by many different banks, but there actually has to be competition between many of these banks, as Nima would like to say, issuing these tokens. I don't like referring them as tokens. I don't know why. Tokens sounds like a weird word to me. Sorry, Nima. It just sounds a bit weird.
No worries.
Tokens.
Sounds like you're on the way to the arcade.
Yeah, you get what I mean, Nima. Like it just sounds a bit weird.
It
Tokens.
is. I think it makes it easier to understand when I explain it sometimes. That's why I might be using it.
It gives you a mental something to hold on to mentally when you're talking about it. So I appreciate it.
So instead of thinking of the arcade, we think of Nima and MMT theory. There we go.
Exactly. You think of tribal chief Nima and his Nima bucks.
And Nima bucks.
Nima bucks.
And then within this conversation, you think of tribal chief Balin. His very, very, very old ancient time Balin and current present day Balin arguing, no, before Chief Nima came, there must have been something else.
Yeah, Chief Nima must have based it on something. That's right.
There must have been something. Of course, this two-way argument will go on for the end of eternity, of course.
We'll be here a while.
That's true.
But of course, there are agreements in many aspects of it in the first place. At least it's not as bad as the Keynesians and our disagreements with them all the time. I'm sure the MMT theorists have a lot of disagreements with Keynesians across the board.
So right now, what we have in place is a currency based on the GDP of the country, if I'm not mistaken. Am I right?
What do you mean by that? Currency based on GDP of the country?
What is our currency based on right now? When I say
Taxation?
based on the GDP, it's based on taxation.
Well, I mean, people need dollars to pay their taxes, and people need and these people need bank reserves and cash currency to pay their taxes, and people need checking account markups to pay debts, to repay debts. So that's what I would say today's money system is based on.
Okay,
Well,
so it's just based on commerce in general then.
I would agree with Nima in that sense, but I believe the actual intentions of taxation by governments is not for in terms of monetary circulation, but rather just to fund fiscal policies such as welfare spending or whatever it is. Now, of course, I don't disagree with the theory and the phenomenon that it's used, that the monetary theory behind it actually does happen. When you tax, you actually get rid of money from circulation. But the other big problem with it is that in most cases, today in modern times at least, this money is usually taxed and then added back within the economy as well, because it goes into welfare spending and other and paying off debts, etc., etc., etc. So therefore, I don't disagree with Nima, of course. The theory stands true in many historical senses, but I don't believe it's the actual phenomenon that we're seeing today. This phenomena is rather that it's for governmental spending rather than, which adds back towards the economy, the overall monetary supply.
Yeah, I think it's both. The purpose of government spending is to move resources into the public sector. Obviously, that's why they do it. But they happen to use money to do that, and the money has value because they've declared a tax. Is how I would put it. And yeah, you're right. Today, I mean, a lot of the rhetoric and the thinking of a lot of people in government is always we have to fund our spending by levying taxes on people. And we need to balance the budget and things like that. So people today think, and I mean, I used to think this too for a long time, the government needs my money to spend. But empirically, that's not really true, because when for example, when I pay my taxes in old dollar bills, they would just shred those dollar bills. They don't need my money. What they're doing is they're making me poorer so I can spend less. That's the ultimate economic effect of taxation.
Of course. It takes away resources from the private sector and gives it to a very inefficient public sector.
It doesn't even give it to them. It doesn't even give it to them. It just destroys them. The public sector never has nor doesn't have any money, is the point, right? They are the scorekeeper that introduces the money into the economy and that destroys it from the economy, the private economy, by taxation.
Yes. I wouldn't disagree there. That I would agree for sure. But of course, taxation's theft.
Taxation's theft.
Taxation's theft.
And this is my thinking. How does this apply now to taxation as theft? Because
that's a great question.
So
that is that's what I've been thinking. If we use taxation as a tool as a monetary tool, then how do we apply this to as taxation's theft? How do we go to the average libertarian saying, well, you see, we tax you just to keep checks in the monetary base per se.
I can rescue it. I think I can rescue that.
Okay.
I would say
prove it to us, Nima. Convince me that my money is worth it.
Some value, but so taxation is needed to give the money some value, but only up to a certain level, and beyond that, it's theft.
Okay. I like that.
I wouldn't disagree there, but the biggest problem is that essentially all taxation is theft per se, and at least the not the theoretical level, in the political and theoretical level, all taxation is technically theft per se. But of course, what you said is true. Of course, there's a certain level where it becomes theft afterwards, which we see today on a very big scale.
If we're going by what Nima said earlier, then taxation isn't actually theft. Taxation is just a reallocation of something that you originally gave out in the first place.
You could look at it that way as well, but the problem is that the attribution becomes very difficult to the individual, right? You don't know that as an individual. You don't feel, it doesn't feel that way, certainly. It's like, I mean, I think they're giving you money. As an individual, maybe you could look at it that way. If I pay a certain amount that I know is necessary to give my money value, that's a nominal small amount, then all right, I'll do it, whatever. But in today's world, it's so far from that. We are, we're paying 50% of our income in taxes. So obviously to everyone, it feels like theft,
Yeah. Yeah, and that's another question I had too, was if you were to, let's say, abolish the income tax, take it completely away, and this is going way off course from what we've been talking about, but if you were to allow people to keep 100% of their earnings and spend it, would that be a boost to the economy? Because from my limited perspective, I always thought that more people spending more money means huge economic boost. But am I wrong in thinking that? Am I just thinking too narrow-mindedly?
I wouldn't say. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Nima.
No, you go ahead.
I wouldn't say it's incorrect. I wouldn't say it's correct because, of course, it's rather that it's not that it's consumption, which is the growth, which is the boost towards economic growth. It's rather that you allow the market to decide whether to save or to consume, and therefore, if we allow money to be held by the private sector in order to actually efficiently allocate these resources, or I would like to say the commodity per se, to efficiently allocate with either saving, capital accumulation, or actually consumption spending, is therefore up to the it's up to the free market rather than rather than actually taxing it, and therefore this kind of removes the amount of resources which can allow further boost between either savings or consumption in the first place. So technically speaking, you are correct, but of course it's not just for consumption; it's also for capital accumulation at the same time.
I would say that I think I would also say you're correct in that you're allowing, if you cut taxes, you're allowing the private sector to develop more, and from that standpoint, you are certainly allowing for more economic activity and potentially more efficient capital allocation, accumulation, capital development, building of machinery, computers, and things like that. And so, in the end, you boost economic growth. If you, for example, if you cut taxes, if the government spending stays the level it is right now, and you cut taxes big time, then there's a huge boost of net private savings into the private sector, and that allows for capital development, for consumer spending, for leveraging, and all those things. So from that standpoint, I think you're right. That's one of my arguments as to why the stock market has possibly gone up quite a bit after Trump's election, because Trump's promised pretty big tax cuts.
Interesting.
I mean, another reason why the stock market is doing very well, as me and you would agree, is because it's an artificially propped up market right now by the Federal Reserve, for sure. I'm sure, I don't know if you agree with me on that, Nima, but today it is, as far as I see it.
Well, you mean because the Fed has dropped the rates so much so that the risk-free rate is lower, which boosts the value of stock investments.
Yes,
I think,
yes.
yeah, I think you can look at it that way. But another way to look at it from my standpoint is, and I've also written about this, a little more complex, but I would say that the natural risk-free interest rate should actually not be very high necessarily. If you think about it, in a free market where the government, where the Federal Reserve doesn't intervene on the interbank lending market by selling treasury bills, the risk-free interbank lending rate would actually drop close to zero. So in a free, unhampered interbank lending market, where you always have excess reserves, by mathematical identity, the risk-free rate would have to drop to zero. So you could say that the natural state of the economy, as natural as it gets with all the other government intervention that we acknowledge is there, it's actually possible that it's not all that abnormal for interest rates to be very low. So from that standpoint, I allow for the possibility that maybe it's not necessarily a propped up market. But however, you could say that if they raise rates again, then of course, then it's a propped up market, and like stock prices are likely going to crash unless earnings are boosted by some other means.
I wouldn't disagree with you on that point for sure. But as I would like to see it right now, currently, it's more of a propped up market than ever before, as in the possibilities higher than what we can perceive from previous standpoints in history with the Federal Reserve. Like, of course, what you said is, of course, completely true, because the risk-free rate would drop. I wouldn't say to 0%, but there
Close
would
to
at
zero.
least be close to zero. Would be a much more noticeable phenomena. But today, it's more likely that the Federal Reserve is actually artificially lowering all interest rates, which is what's propping up the markets per se, rather than it just being a phenomenon of, well,
I mean, you could
that's a
say,
whole
for
entire
example,
another story.
in Japan, for example, what you're saying is obviously true, because the central bank of Japan is outright buying index funds in the stock
Yes,
market.
It's
So,
ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous. I mean, the question that I'd like to ask is, how long can this go on for before something goes very wrong, really badly wrong?
And that's kind of the question I had here, because you have Rand Paul and his audit the Fed bill, and you have, I mean, Ron Paul was talking about that earlier, and you have pretty much every libertarian wanting to audit the Fed and the Federal Reserve in some way or another. And I just wonder, for the average person, what does that mean? Why would you audit the Fed, for one, and for two, if what we've said so far is that what we're living in is somewhat of a natural course of events in economics, getting rid of the central banking system, getting rid of the way that things are done now, is that even something that we would want to do? Is that something that is there a better option out there that we could be using, or is this kind of as good as it gets and we just have to try to keep piecing it together and taping the holes?
It's a great question. Yeah.
It's a good question. It's a very good question.
Yeah, I think we are seeing the beginnings potentially of true alternatives with things like Bitcoin and stuff like that. But I think you're right in that, at least in my opinion, empirically, the system we have today is actually more true and tried than a lot of us think. I'm not saying that it's the best system that's possible or that it's even a great system, but and I'm also not saying it's not flawed. And talking about audit the Fed, I think, of course, why should we not audit? Why should public institutions not be open and auditable by the public? I would be much more interested just from a criminal standpoint. I want to know what they have done that we're not aware of. I mean, you know, I don't know if you're aware by the things that banks in the US have done to fund secret CIA projects, for example, savings and loan crisis. And even from that standpoint, I would like to know to what extent the Federal Reserve has been involved, because the Federal Reserve is the central clearinghouse for all these banks. So what have they been doing that we're not aware of?
Exactly. I would agree with Nima on that sense as well. But the thing is that not only do we have to audit the Fed, but we have to also introduce competition towards the Fed. We can, for example, we can just leave the Fed as it be. But if we go back towards a free banking sector, at least slowly introduce it, we would at least avoid the risk that is associated with just having the Fed and not auditing them. Or, for example, just auditing them once and then the Fed somehow finds different ways of doing what Nima said are criminal type of activities, a lot of fraud, a lot of funds where they shouldn't be per se. But however, if we introduce if we introduce competition into play, this would likely reduce the likelihood of the risk which the Federal Reserve has introduced by being the only issuer of currency and the only issuer of, as Nima would like to say, of tokens. So therefore, not only should we introduce an audit for the Fed to understand what they're doing right now, but if we do find something which is a criminal basis around the Fed, or something criminal related, we must also introduce some competition, allow competition to enter into the market, so that because as we know, the free market has the ability to at least ethically work better than a state-imposed type of market system. And therefore, if competition comes into play over the long run, we wouldn't see more cases of, for example, if we do find anything with the Fed of such criminal activities in the first place, or with any mismanagement of funds where they shouldn't be in the first place, the funds that the Federal Reserve has made into existence.
For example, AIG. Why did the Federal Reserve buy AIG? That's crazy.
Exactly.
And AIG is such a murky institution. Their CEO or founder was at one point considered as head of the CIA. The CIA has very close ties with insurance companies. There's a lot of shadowy stuff that we've never been told, that we're unaware of. I'd like to know more about that. Even that alone would be huge, already.
Exactly, and like I said, just from perspective, we in order to, if we do find anything per se, in order to reduce these phenomena which the Federal Reserve should not be acting in, it's not that we have to regulate the Federal Reserve. Adding more regulation does not stop the Federal Reserve bypassing these regulations. As we see in regulations within the normal economy, they usually do not work in stopping negative outcomes, which marketplaces tend to put out, but instead rather encourage it in some ways, encourage risk and adverse selection in the first place. The only way to reduce those risk and adverse selection is by introducing competition, allowing the flow of competition into play. And therefore, if we have other institutions which are willing to issue their own currency, whether it being backed by whatever the hell it is, being backed by a glass of milk, or I don't care what the hell it is, whatever commodity it is, it has to be, of course, something valuable per se. That would add a lot of pressure on the federal. Yeah, there we go. It would add a lot of pressure. It would add a lot of
Use
pressure
every
on the
opportunity.
Federals. It would add a lot of pressure on the Federal Reserve not to be to take risky decisions and take adverse decision makings, as Frederick Hayek actually argues in some cases. As well.
In his monetary I've read his monetary reconstruction, for example, but the only thing is that the one thing we can't compete with the Fed on is that their token is demanded in tax payments. That's one of the big challenges, right? If there's a central government that imposes taxes, people will always need money to pay their taxes. So it's hard to sort of a step away or get out of the monetary system that we're in, simply because the sovereign issuer of the currency demands it in taxes. So that doesn't mean that we can't have competing means of payments like Bitcoin, stuff like that, but there's always going to be that challenge. So until we abolish taxation, I'm not saying I'm against that. It's hard to compete on those grounds, at least.
Yes. As you put it, basically the government also grants a monopoly towards the Federal Reserve by the means of how taxes are paid. However, what I would say is that if we were to actually, how can I put it? If we were to move away from the monopoly, maybe that we can allow taxation, although of course I wouldn't say allow taxation, I would say abolish taxation altogether as a libertarian, but of course, unfortunately, we have to be realistic altogether. If we were to do taxation, maybe taxation could be in a form that if we look at one currency being issued by one lending institution compared to the Federal Reserve, it must equal the amount of the Federal Reserve per se in its purchasing power equivalent. So for example, if the $1 is worth $2 Federal Reserve notes, therefore you can pay your taxes in this many $1 in order to,
So you mean for the government to start accepting different currencies?
Different currencies. That would work. Of course, some currencies would be very worthless. So that does cause a bit of issues on what currencies are to be accepted.
And you'll have everyone, you'll have Ballant and everyone else competing and lobbying the government to accept their currency and taxes.
Yeah,
right?
that causes a bit of issues everywhere. That's your aha moment.
No, I'm not saying that it's a bad idea. It introduces
execution would be very hard to accomplish per se without any crony capitalism coming into existence.
Would it be possible to just put one or two competing factions, or to allow one or two competing factions, and that's it? Have a bit of a broader monopoly? Would that make any difference, or does it have to be completely free, or just what we have right now?
See, that would be a maybe, but the biggest problem is who chooses the other two technical monopoly players? Who is the determinant of those two monopoly players? Yeah. So that's a very big what question, because if the government is the chooser of winner and losers, then we're back to square one basically.
Yeah.
Which is the biggest problem. So my solution is abolish all taxation and everything will be perfectly fine altogether.
Done.
Roads.
No more roads. No need for roads.
There'll be private roads. They'll be much more beautiful.
No, who needs roads? We'll have flying cars, Nemo. For the love of God, come on.
I want a jetpack.
There we go.
I want a flying Aston Martin. Nice. I don't care about these road cars anymore. I just
don't the Saudi cops have those?
What, flying cars?
Yes.
I'm not aware of flying cars. With flying cars, I'm not sure about that.
I saw a Saudi police. Was it a Bugatti? The other day?
Yeah, I've seen that.
That's not Saudi. That's Dubai. It was Dubai.
Oh, it's Dubai. Okay. They have some.
They have Bugattis. They have Ferraris. They're just insane. They're just spending money like it's like if it's the end of the world tomorrow.
I mean, they're literally building islands in the ocean. There's so much money that there's nothing else to do but build islands.
The thing is that Dubai doesn't actually have that much money. They keep on running into deficits, and they keep on running out of money all of a sudden, like they did in the 2008 financial crisis.
Okay.
And it's completely absurd. Absurd. There we go. That's the word. Gosh, I think I should go take an English class sometime soon, because God knows what's happening to my English right now. But anyways, it's completely absurd that when a government thinks that they can continue spending and trying to get the economy running by just continuously stimulating the economy. Of course, we know the more you try to stimulate an economy, the less likely the economy will actually get stimulated. And if you look at the amount of stimulus that was put into the US economy compared to GDP growth within the United States, as in if we compare the amount of fiscal stimulus, it keeps on increasing, these stimuluses, but yet GDP growth continues to decrease, which therefore shows that, of course, if we look at stimulus towards economic growth, the laws of marginal utility, diminishing marginal utility, also apply in that sector. And therefore, what Dubai is doing is not sustainable in the long term altogether.
Interesting.
It's oil revenue, right? As long as they have oil revenue, I guess.
Actually, it's not oil revenue. Dubai is a main port for shipping.
Okay.
It's a huge
but
port for shipping.
isn't it by extension benefiting from the Saudis' oil riches in that sense?
They also have oil production in UAE, but they're doing a lot of things. They want to get into nuclear, they want to get into solar, they want to get into this, they want to get into that. I don't know what they're going to do the next day, but it's going to be something ridiculous, and they won't have the money for it, and it'll take another 50 million years to get it done. So, well, whatever it is, they'll just think of something. But actually, as I told you, Peter Klein is in Bahrain, Nima, and essentially he was talking about entrepreneurship. In Bahrain, we have an economic development board, which dictates by giving incubators towards like these centers which allow for small entrepreneurs to grow and etc. And essentially, Peter Klein's conclusion was, there we go. You've linked about diminishing returns.
I'm just adding it there for later.
For later, yes. It's essentially what Peter Klein says is that policymakers can't really grow entrepreneurship within a country. And of course, there's so much empirical evidence for it. If we look at incubators, rather than the incubators themselves are helping the entrepreneurs, just being associated by the government gets you investments, but these investments are not necessarily the right type of investments. Now, what I can tell you in Bahrain is that we're having what I would say is a fast food bubble at the moment, induced by, I know it sounds a bit silly, fast food bubble. I wonder how we'd ever get into that, a restaurant bubble, because living in Bahrain, I've noticed, I still haven't done any empirical research on this, if there's an actual bubble, but it's just to my perception of what I've seen so far, is that when I was living here in 2010, when I was about 13, 14 years old, I tend to notice that there's just a few restaurants, like some restaurants here and there, and they weren't opening in such large rates. And all of a sudden, in the past 2 years, there's like a million different local bakeries right next to each other coming out of nowhere. I'm like, this can't be possible. Where do all these local bakeries and all these local dining joints come from? And after, of course, I know that the Bahrain Development Bank funds many of these restaurants. I know from what I heard here and there from different talk. So what I would like to do is I would like to take empirical evidence showing that, hey, you guys have a problem. Rather than funding entrepreneurship, you're actually funding a bubble right now, which is being fueled by two things: the expansion of credit by the government, the Bahrain Development Board, Bahrain Development Bank, and secondly, from all the Saudis, which I think about 9 million Saudis come a year into Bahrain, into our island, which only has a population of 1,500,000. So 9 million divided by 52 weeks, they come every weekend. That's a lot of Saudis, of course. It causes a lot of headaches when you're driving, because they're not very good at driving, the Saudis, unfortunately. Essentially, their salaries have started to diminish at the moment. They're starting to get cut at the moment. And if their salaries are are diminishing at the moment, they could easily just stay in Saudi and eat food. They don't have to come to Bahrain and shop and whatnot, because it may become in the near future an alternative which is not viable. Although, of course, food is an inelastic type of substance, because food by itself is always, no matter what price changes happens, we need food per se. But the biggest problem is that there's a Bahrain market and there's a Saudi market. If Saudis, for example, see a decline in their income, they'll most likely want to purchase items in Saudi Arabia rather than Bahrain, because Bahrain's currency is more valuable than the Saudi currency per se. So of course, their purchasing power in Saudi Arabia is greater than in Bahrain. But Bahrain, of course, has a lot of benefits, such as like you know, prostitutes, nightclubs, alcohol. So therefore, they all come and become unhalal for
How
a good weekend.
how easy is it to travel between Bahrain and Saudi Arabia?
We have a bridge. You go through passport control, and you're in Saudi or Bahrain. Of course, GCC residents are, of course, you don't need a visa to go into Saudi or Bahrain. For example, if you guys came and you lived in Bahrain, you'd have to apply for a visa to get into Saudi Arabia. But going from Bahrain to Saudi Arabia is not the hard bit. Like, that's fine, because not a lot of Bahrainis go to Saudi Arabia in the first place during the weekends. It's coming from Saudi Arabia to Bahrain, which is the biggest headache, because the crowd is absolutely insane all over the place. The passport controls is crazy, and when a new lane opens, all of a sudden you see like a million Saudi cars just swoosh along towards that new passport control board.
Wow.
But essentially, what I'm trying to say is that I want to look at how much funding has been going into these new restaurants. Like, of course, not specific restaurants, in the aggregate, how much they've increased. Any drops in interest rates are accompanied with these increases of funding within these restaurants. What are the profitabilities towards those restaurants in the first place? Have they started to diminish? If they've diminished, there's two indications. A, there's an increase of competition, or B, their actual marginal returns are diminishing because they're inside a bubble, and that bubble is starting to burst in the first place. Because as bubble starts to burst, the actual returns within that a company makes will start to decrease within that industry in the first place. And the third thing is, I would like to see the flow of immigration, the flow of cash between Saudi and Bahrain in the first place. How much cash, or at least an estimate, is being spent within the in the restaurant industry in the first place. And if my findings are correct, that the amount being funded within restaurants has increased, and that the amount the cost of capital has essentially decreased due to a decrease of interest rates in the first place. The weighted average cost of capital has decreased due to an artificially pushed down of interest rates, and that there's a diminishing return. Sorry, there's a diminishing factor of returns and profitability, and that there's less immigration between Saudi Arabia and Bahrain during the weekends, and that the spending within these restaurants are starting to decline. Then this gives all the indications that we are inside a bubble, a restaurant bubble per se, as I'd like to say. The fast food bubble would be the title of my work. But at the moment, I'm currently working on a book which explains Obama's 8 years, Obamonomics, 8 years of failed central planning, which I hope you guys would look forward to reading.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to
read
it.
it. Yeah, I'd love to read it.
Of course, me and Nima would agree in most things, but then there's a few things which we disagree on, and then like today.
But that's usually where we find the closest thing to reality or to the truth, is when you have two conflicting viewpoints. So it's awesome, guys. I have to go. I've run out of time, but I still have a lot of questions. We've just had so much to talk about. There's just so much going on that let's try another one if we can soon. Because man, I want to talk about wage. I want to talk about the deficit spending. There's just so much that I'd love to touch
I took
on.
too much time with Bahrain. Just took a good 10 minutes of talking about Bahrain and our bubble in Bahrain per se.
But even that is interesting, because I mean, for example, I've heard coming up soon here, there's potentially a car bubble, at least in North America, which is just an
I think this is worldwide.
Is it worldwide?
I believe it's worldwide, and the biggest problem is I want to get into the car industry and open my own car company per se. And then now there's a car bubble, so that's like not the best thing to get into right now. It's like,
Just as
no,
it's about to
why?
burst.
Just as it's about to burst, why? Why is it about to burst now? I won't be able to make my cool cars in the
Which is
future,
too bad.
unfortunately.
Because they are very
Yeah, it's
cool.
too bad, unfortunately.
So I've heard some of those ideas, man, and I'd buy those cars. They're awesome. All right, well, guys, it's been a lot of fun. I really appreciate you guys getting on. And
Yeah, so I enjoyed it by far.
it was a lot of fun, guys. I really do appreciate it. And let's do it again. Let's definitely have another chat.
That'd be awesome.
All
Yeah,
right.
it'll be awesome for sure.
Yeah, thanks, guys.
The,
All right, awesome.
the internal debate between being libertarian economists.
Right, exactly.
No,
No, it's interesting because I mean, for a lot of us, we hear the rhetoric and we hear the catchphrases and those, you know, those taxation is theft, those very catchy words and phrases, but we don't, like, for me, I don't understand a lot of it. I don't know a lot of it, and there's a lot of questions that come up, and sometimes it's hard to get the answer when you're in your own type of bubble, I guess, of people who don't want to go against the grain. So I really appreciate that there's actual thinking outside the box here, and that
Of
some
course,
of the
of
stuff we
course.
talked about just completely challenged a lot of my thinking. So again, thanks, and definitely we'll do it again soon.
Definitely.
Yeah, thanks, guys.
All right, guys, have a good one.
See you guys.
Have a good one. Bye.
It was fun.